Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining the Colorado Sun's It's Time to Vote Forum. I'm John Frank, the Sun's politics editor and the lead writer of our politics newsletter, The Unaffiliated. For the next hour, we're going to talk to the state's top election official and a panel of election experts to discuss the voting process in Colorado, as well as the security of the election. It'll be a rapid-fire discussion because there's so much to discuss, but we'll spend at least half the program answering your questions. We've received dozens of questions from readers so far, but if you have additional ones that come up during the conversation, please drop them in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to all of them, or at least as many as we can here by the end. Now, this forum is part of a larger project at the Sun, where we're working to educate voters about the voting process, the candidates, and the ballot questions. And we would like to thank the American Press Institute for supporting our project. If you want to read more of our coverage, click on the Colorado Voter Guide at the top of our website at coloradosun.com. Now I want to introduce you to our first guest, Secretary of State Jena Griswold. She took office in January 2019, and in her first 2 years has overseen 4 statewide elections, which is quite a trial by fire. Griswold is the youngest elected Secretary of State in the United States, and she spent much of her childhood growing up in Estes Park. She was the first person in her family to attend 4-year college and law school. And before being elected, she practiced international anti-corruption law, as well as worked as a voter protection attorney. She lives in Louisville. Secretary Griswold, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the conversation, and we'll just get right to it here. The first question we have is, we continue to hear concern about election interference and read headlines about voting glitches in other states, just Virginia the other day. Tell us, how confident are you that Colorado's election will be glitch-free?
Well, John, thank you for having me on and for highlighting this important conversation. There has been a lot of elections this year, from our first presidential primary in 20 years to our statewide primary during a pandemic, which, by the way, just proved how resilient our election model is. We had a record turnout during the pandemic, to this upcoming election that we are in right now. And I would say I am completely confident in our elections. We are seeing increased foreign interference, just like we saw in 2016, but Colorado really leads the nation when it comes to election security. And a lot of that, the next panelist can discuss, especially Secretary Williams. You know, when Secretary Williams was Secretary of State, the Washington Post considered Colorado the safest state to cast a ballot in. And we have just continued that legacy, really focusing on cybersecurity. And to take a step back, to be very clear, you can't actually hack the election in Colorado. That's because we have a voter verified paper ballot. Paper ballot is not hackable. Our team, actually our security team, goes across the state to do a secure build of all our voting equipment. None of the voting equipment is connected to the internet. And then another innovation that Colorado was first in the nation to do, risk limiting audit, will show us to a statistical degree of certainty that the election results, that we can be highly confident in their accuracy. Now, with that said, of course, there are support systems that we are working to protect. And the Secretary of State's office has over 40 people in an IT and security team working around the clock. We lead the nation in cyber innovations. And I just rolled out even a further innovation, which I think you all are going to be talking about in the next half an hour. And that's our new rescue team, focused on misinformation and combating the newest cyber innovations and cyber threats. So happy to go into more detail, John, but I'm very confident in our elections, and I'm just excited that people are already voting.
And I guess I should say, how is it going so far? Have we experienced any problems? Because voters did start to get their ballots on Saturday, and some people are even voting in person in some counties already.
You know, so far it's going pretty well. You know, there were a little, gosh, what's the right word? Hiccups with the Postal Service several months ago. But we're really happy to see that mail ballots have gone out so fast. You know, the initial mailing started on Friday. It would traditionally start this last Monday, but it was a holiday, so it got kicked back to Friday. And that initial mailing will go out, will continue through this Friday. And we're getting reports across the state that mail ballots are quickly going out. I think you can see on social media, everybody really excited to vote. You know, all drop boxes and polling centers will be open on the 19th. but some are already open. And to your point, results are, or ballots are being turned in, and they're being collected by all the county clerks.
When it comes to potential problems, what are
Yeah.
you watching most closely? Or put another way, what's the biggest threat to our system?
Well, I think the biggest threat is undermining confidence, and that comes in many shapes and forms. We know that foreign adversaries are trying to undermine our democracy. I would say the top three threats from foreign adversaries are: number one, the scanning of election infrastructure itself. Since 2016, when this threat really emerged in a big way, the nation is just light years ahead. There's still a lot of work to be done, but Colorado really is leading the nation when it comes to cyber innovation. The second threat, and this isn't specific to elections, but just infrastructure, is the uptick of ransomware attacks that we have seen. Our office, the Secretary of State's office, is actually protecting all the county clerks' computers, infrastructure that attaches to any of our statewide infrastructure. And so far, that's going really well. One of the things that I believe Secretary Williams started was a partnership with the National Guard to monitor our infrastructure as we get closer to the elections. We've done that partnership for the last so all the elections that I've overseen. And it's really neat because the National Guard team that was with us in 2019 is the same team that was with us in our tabletop exercise in January, and also in our state primary and presidential primary. So we're all training together and working together. And the third biggest threat is disinformation. And that is really hard to tackle. And I do think that as Colorado, we need to continue the conversation, and nationally we do. Because we're seeing foreign adversaries use social media as a tool to suppress the vote of Americans. So this isn't just about one person saying a wrong information on a street corner or even on social media. This is a coordinated effort from foreign adversaries. One of the things that I was hoping to do last legislative session is run a model piece of legislation to combat disinformation. So we were working on that, looking at all the best practices across the nation. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, we did not get that piece of legislation through, but I hope to continue that conversation. But we're also just launching new efforts to be able to monitor social media and the dark web for misinformation about the elections. We have this new unit within my office. We are about to launch an educational effort. And I think that the number one thing when it comes to information for voters is just really think about who is sending the information you're consuming. If it's just on social media, you need to think twice and go to your trusted source of election information, and that's your county clerk or your Secretary of State in Colorado. And in Colorado, everything is centralized at govotecolorado.gov, and you can always call our office with any election questions also.
Wonderful, that's helpful for our voters. I want to stay on this topic of misinformation because you've been pushing back on it yourself a good bit, and that means tweeting at President Donald Trump, pushing back about his statements regarding mail ballots and so forth. I'm curious, at what point did you decide to take on Trump so directly? And, was there a moment that led to this shift?
Well, I think it's just so important to get correct information to Colorado voters. And I think it's very unfortunate the amount of misinformation we've seen peddled by foreign adversaries and also, some elected officials because they have a pretty big platform. So as Secretary of State, I see it as my job to push back on any misinformation and try to get good information to Colorado voters. Misinformation can shape how people behave. And in Colorado, we know our system is a great system. Wayne Williams implemented vote by mail for all. It works really well. On top of that, on top of sending a ballot to every registered voter, of course, we have early voting, same-day voter registration, online voter registration, and we are the talk of the nation. And I think one piece of misinformation that I think is really important is the idea that vote by mail only helps one party over the other, when our state is proof that that is just incorrect. We've had more Republican voters use a mail ballot in the last 2 out of 3 general elections. And in our statewide primary, so in June, even with some of the false narratives swirling around, even with early voting, a lot of access, we saw a higher percentage of Republicans, just a little bit, but a higher percentage decide to use a mail ballot than Democrats. So I do think that it's really important to stand up for Colorado voters because honestly, the facts speak for themselves. All voters use mail ballots. And that's just even more important now when we're in the midst of a pandemic.
Your approach has not gone unnoticed. We had a reader ask, I guess in regard to your tweets, most likely, why are you politicizing the office instead of focusing on smooth and safe elections for Colorado? How would you respond?
Well, I would say I am focused on smooth and safe elections for Coloradans. And part of that is having confidence in our system. To share with you, my mom will drive an hour one way to get to her job at a hospital. She's a nurse. She works 12-hour shifts. And for the first couple of months of the pandemic, she was exclusively taking care of COVID patients. I am very passionate about making sure that Coloradans know that our system, it works, it's safe, it's secure, and it's accessible. Because vote by mail is the most responsible way to vote during a pandemic. Not only for the people voting that mail ballot, because it helps us have our voices heard while also social distancing, but also for the people who have to go vote in person. If we can get more Coloradans, a higher percentage of voters voting that mail ballot, that means there's less people in the polls and a decreased potential of spreading COVID-19. And I can go into all the reforms we've done this year to make sure our elections are as accessible and safe as possible. So I view it as making sure to stand up and push back against false narratives. And I'll always use my position to protect our election system. It works. We can always, fine tune it on the edges and increase access even further, but it's a good system. And we should be really proud of it and we should have confidence in it.
Do you think some of this criticism you received recently is valid, or like some of your allies, do you feel like this is more a byproduct of sexism or possibly ageism?
Well, I would say, I'm a different type of person to win statewide office. I'm the youngest Secretary of State in the nation. I literally grew up in a cabin with an outhouse outside in rural Colorado. And I'm just the 10th woman to directly be elected to statewide constitutional office in 144 years of Colorado's history. So, my perspective may be a little different than, the leadership in other statewide offices over the last about 140 plus years. But I'll always push for access. And I think our results speak for themselves. We had the highest, we set a record turnout during a pandemic. That is not a situation that most secretaries of state have had to deal with. We have, I was really happy to see a higher percentage of Republicans use a mail ballot than Democrats, because we are in a different situation with a top elected official spreading false narratives. And we've just been innovating. Since I've been Secretary of State, I've really tried to build on Wayne's work and the legislature's work. We've increased drop boxes by over 50%. There'll be an additional 42 voting centers this election, so over 340 voting centers across the nation. We've instituted ballot tracks, which Amber was really instrumental to in Denver. We just launched Text to Cure, which helps crack the nut at the disproportionate signature discrepancies for young people. We've sent PPE. The list goes on, and I would love to explain how all the things we are doing really lead the nation and lead us in the right way. And the right way is to continue our legacy of just having great elections and some of the highest voter turnout in the nation. And I hope this year, the highest.
I want to ask you about one of those dynamics that I'm not sure we've quite seen an answer to. We highlighted this in the unaffiliated political newsletter on Tuesday. Just looking at some recent reports by colleagues out there in Colorado who found some racial inequities in our system. One is the racial turnout gap in Colorado is higher than the national average.
The racial what, I'm sorry?
Turnout gap is higher, meaning not enough minorities are showing up to vote. And two, counties with larger minority populations have higher ballot rejection rates. So the question's, do you think we have inequities in our system, and what's the cause, and how can we address them?
That's a great question, because I think it's really timely, both with how our election system responds to the pandemic, but also how Colorado's election system can help lead the way to some of the racial injustice and the systematic racism we are seeing across the nation. One thing with vote by mail is that when we adopted mail ballots sent to every registered voter, participation rates increased by 9% statewide. By the way, evenly among Republicans and Democrats, 8% among registered Republicans and Democrats. But then we saw a 13% increase among Black voters, a 10% increase among Latino voters, 11% among Asian, and 16% among voters under the age of 30. So I do think that it's very important as a Secretary of State responsible for making sure all communities have their voices heard to clearly state that very often voter suppression is systemic racism. And one of the tools that we have, not the only tool, but one of the tools that we have is vote by mail. It did increase turnout among historically disenfranchised communities. With that said, our signature verification process, it's actually the lowest in the nation in terms of signature discrepancies. But I think we always can be improving. When we look at the data, it turns out that younger people, the younger you are, the more likely you're not going to have your ballot. You're going to have an issue with your ballot because of your signature. And the reason because of that is that younger people just have less signatures in our systems. So one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about implementing text to cure is it's an easier way for more people to cure their signatures using technology. And obviously, like millennials, younger people are on our phones all the time. So it's just trying to meet voters where they are. But I think it's really important two other points. First, there's all different reasons why there are different discrepancies from one county to the other, or even one election to the other election. Turnout changes. You might have more new voters one year to the other. You might also have different strategies. So campaigns might go try to cure a bunch of signatures because the race is really close. But if the race is not really close, they might not. So I would just say we're always looking to improve the system. That's what we're seeing this year. And along those lines, I think it's important to highlight a historical voter suppression that has happened in Colorado and is still, we're still seeing the huge effects. And that's the voting rates among Native Americans living on tribal lands. Native Americans living on tribal lands did not have their rights to vote recognized until the early 70s. So even though we lead the nation in Colorado in terms of percentage of eligible people registered, 92%, when you go down and talk with the Ute Mountain Ute or the Southern Ute, those registration rates are around the 30% mark. And even though we have often the first or the second highest turnout rate in the nation, they are very low on tribal lands. And that's why I think we have to look at any issues, recognize them, and try to fix them. So I've been partnering with both tribes. We ran a huge Native American voting rights piece of legislation in the Colorado Votes Act, but that doesn't stop there. I just visited both the tribes again. We're working on strategies to make sure that we're addressing this historical disenfranchisement. And I'm just really honored to be able to work with the tribes on that. Work with the tribes, excuse me if I said that wrong.
Oh, sure, thank you. And just a reminder, if you're joining us on Zoom and you have a question for Secretary Griswold, please put it in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to them all. That said, we've already had readers submit many questions, so let's turn to more of those now. Here's a big question on readers' minds. What do you expect on election day, election night, or afterward? I guess let me add here that U.S. national media executives recently not to make projections on election night. You've apologized for the tweets, but you still believe the concept is valid. Talk to us about what you imagine for election day and election night.
Well, I think we're going to have record turnout. We're already seeing that in a lot of states with early voting. We've seen that for the last 2 weeks, and I do expect that will continue. That's why I'm so proud of our work in the Colorado Votes Act in 2019. Because we tremendously increased drop boxes, we increased voter service and polling centers, and then for the first time ever, there's a guaranteed voting center or drop box on all our public universities and tribal lands at tribal leadership request. So increased access. So that's what I expect. I expect that we'll have just a tremendous turnout across the nation, and we'll just have to wait and see how that goes. One of the things about the Colorado election model is it's not just the access points that is really impressive. It's the small things, not so small, but the things that we don't usually talk about that is also really important. So for example, the fact that in Colorado, county clerks can start processing mail ballots well before election day enables us to report results faster. And I know, John, you've been around Colorado elections long enough to know that sometimes races, the media does not call a race the night of election night, but at least we can process a lot of the ballots. So in our statewide primary, we were able to report on election night itself, 89% of the ballots. I'm gonna guess that it's gonna be less than 89% because there's just gonna be so many more ballots. But it also really depends on voters' behavior, whether people really vote early. We're encouraging people to vote early. Return your mail ballot as soon as possible. If you need in person, go vote early in person. So there's a lot of variables that will determine exactly what election night looks like in Colorado.
And just a quick side note to add to what you put there, Colorado, they can start counting ballots 15 days ahead of time.
That's right. That's right. Or processing. So you don't announce the results.
Of course, thank you.
Yeah.
Here's another reader question. It's one of my favorites because it shows just how engaged people are this election year. The question is, since Colorado's voting system is relatively safe, what can Coloradans do to, one, help ensure minimal chaos on or after Election Day here at home, and two, provide support to other states' election integrity efforts?
Well, I think we've done a lot of the work leading up. So for example, we saw in some states' primaries a lack of election judges that shut down in-person voting locations. So we saw that and reacted right away. I launched an election judge recruitment program. We recruited close to 7,000 election judges. So while some states are still seeing a little bit of a shortage, we're not. We're ready to go. And those election judges are just so crucial. I would say the number one thing that your county clerks will appreciate is voting early. That just eases the amount of people going in on election day. It makes all of our lives just a little easier. So we encourage early voting. I would say because of the pandemic and just because it's, Coloradans already love mail ballots, it's doubly important to vote that mail ballot. Gosh, what else?
What else can they do? We have another question in the chat of maybe this is part of this is how are you helping other states follow our model? Maybe there's something there.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting in March or early April, I started working with secretaries of state across the nation, sharing tips about the Colorado election model, and so did our elections division. Which, by the way, is largely the same election division that was under Wayne. They're wonderful. They do such a great job. And I think they should be thanked every single day. They do a really good job. So they started sharing tips too. And a lot of that sharing has already been done. So we've seen a huge expansion of mail ballots this year. So the Washington Post is estimating that over 80% of Americans will have access to a mail ballot. To put that in perspective, in 2016, about a quarter of Americans voted a mail ballot. We're also sharing or have been sharing tips like rules around drop boxes. How many drop boxes do you really need? Signature cure. I've been encouraging other states to use signature cure when they're expanding their mail ballot systems. So you name it, we've been in discussions at this point. Voting has really started across the nation. And so there is some lawsuits, of course, still working, but I think we've really left our footprint. And what I hope, John, is that after this election, we don't forget the topic of our democracy. Because we do see in other states things that don't work as well as they could. They don't work like they do in Colorado. And I believe that every American, whether you're in, regardless of what state you're in, regardless of what color your skin, how much money is in your bank account, you deserve access. So I do believe we need a national conversation and federal guidelines to make sure that all Americans have the same type of access as Coloradans.
One more, we're running out of time here, so maybe we can keep these answers a little shorter so we can get to more questions. But a reader wrote to us with a pretty serious question that I'm, to be honest, not quite sure about the answer to. So she wrote that I have every intention to use a Dropbox to submit my ballot. However, talking with friends, a question arose. Is a person with a concealed carry or open carry permit allowed to bring a weapon into a polling place? And she continues, this question brought up a heated discussion on the possibility of intimidation at polling places. It's a conversation the reader said she never thought she would have.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could, one, respond to those specific questions she had, and two, reflect on the broader question of whether you expect to see any violence at the polls this year.
Well, so whether you can, go in armed into a polling location really depends on the polling location. So some states completely bar any type of guns at voting centers. In Colorado, it's not how it works. There is no statewide rule. So the answer, unfortunately, is it really depends. And if you have any questions, contact your county clerk. In terms of voter intimidation, it is something that is concerning. We are seeing a lot of really heated rhetoric. And what I can say is that I'm working very closely with the attorney generals. We have a great team, and we will act very quickly if we do see voter intimidation. We want to make sure that every Coloradan, Republican, Democrat, Independent, all feel safe, secure, when they go to vote. And luckily, we have a lot of different options. They're all fantastic. So whether that's voting your mail ballot and returning it by the mail, to returning it to one of hundreds of drop boxes, or voting in person, I think we'll have a really great experience this year. And if there are any issues, we're ready. We have the contingencies ready to go, and we'll make sure that the voting experience goes as smoothly as possible.
One more quick question here is,
Sure.
How can we be sure that there won't be unofficial ballot collection boxes like the headlines we saw out of California this week? A reader asks, some states also allow others to collect ballots. In Colorado, you can have up to 10 ballots. One, can you inform us a little bit about what you're doing to avoid the situation in California, and also address the ballot harvesting question?
Sure. So my understanding is, and we'd have to go verify with California, that they don't have laws on the books like we do. So there's a law on the book, to your point, that a person can only collect 10 ballots. So if we were to see drop boxes, unofficial drop boxes pop up, we would immediately act. It's not only illegal under the ballot collecting rules, but also under other laws. So we would immediately act. In terms of, was there a second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Ballot harvesting, the fact you can take up to 10 here in Colorado, do you feel like that's appropriate, or how would you?
That is the law on the books. And I do think that the idea that I would take my partner's ballot to a mailbox makes sense, or to a drop box, excuse me. And we haven't seen issues with ballot collection in the past. And if there are issues, we'll just we're ready to act to make sure that our elections work just really well.
Wonderful. And we told you we would be done at 12:30 with your portion, so I want to be respectful of your time. First of all, let me say thank you personally for appearing, and on behalf of our readers, thank you for taking the time to answer some of their questions about the election. We, of course, didn't get to all of them, but we will try to answer more in the next panel. Secretary Griswold, thank you so much.
Thank you. One last word. I just encourage folks to go to govotecolorado.gov. You can register to vote still and still be mailed a ballot. Of course, you can register all the way up to Election Day. As long as you're there in person by 7 p.m., you can register and cast a ballot. And I just really appreciate it, John. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks again for having us. And we'll move to the second part of our program now, diving even deeper into the topic of election security with three leading experts with vast experience in this area. I'll introduce them, and then we'll run through a few questions. Amber McReynolds is the former Denver Director of Elections. She is one of the nation's leading experts on election administration and co-author of the book When Women Vote, which is dog-eared and annotated on my desk right now. We also have Wayne Williams, the former Republican Secretary of State from 2015 to 2019. He is currently a member of the Colorado Springs City Council, and he previously served on the El Paso County Board of Commissioners and as the El Paso County Clerk. And finally, we're excited to have Nathan Blumenthal. He's the head of Election Security and Cybersecurity Unit at the Secretary of State's office. Prior to that role, he served as Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention for the Department of Homeland Security, and previously led DHS's Countering Foreign Influence Task Force, which combated the threat of foreign influence in the 2018 election. I'm going to ask a series of questions with each panelist, and then we'll open it up for a broader discussion. Secretary Williams, let me start with you. Your successor, Jena Griswold, just mentioned you plenty in the last segment. She's been in the spotlight lately and the subject of criticism. I'm wondering what you think of the job she's doing and the controversy when it comes to partisanship of Secretary of State's office.
It always is a challenge in an elected office in maintaining balance. I believe that, and I worked very hard to make sure during my time the Secretary of State's office was nonpartisan, that I didn't intervene in areas that might be more of a political nature. I do want to say I appreciate the comments from her with respect to my work. I should note that much of that rests on my predecessors, Natalie Myers, Danetta Davidson, who I think is on the call with us, Scott Gessler. Each of them took steps that helped us move in the direction we did. So in terms of, let me talk specifically about the controversy about mail ballots. Colorado's system works because we do it right. We have accurate voter lists, we have bipartisan judges, we have video surveillance of the drop boxes, we've got limits on ballot harvesting, we have signature verification, we have a risk limiting audit. That's different than what was passed by the US House on mostly a party line vote. In that bill, there is a provision that would strip Colorado of its ability to engage in signature verification. And so when you talk about mail ballots under the Colorado method and with the protections we have are safe. I wrote an op-ed in Colorado Politics as ballots drop for the primary in June. I've written prior op-eds with Bernie Busher and others, who's another former Secretary of State who helped make some progress. But the national law or national bill that was passed in a party line vote by the House would strip Colorado of the critical protection of signature verification. So when you hear someone say mail ballots are ripe with fraud, under the House bill, yes. Under the Colorado method, fraud is prevented because signatures that do not match are not counted. And so I think you see part of the challenge going on nationally is people talking in bold strokes without looking at the specifics of the differences. And in this case, the differences make all the difference in the world. Because in Colorado, when someone says, oh, I found a bunch of ballots at the post office, or my dorm got a bunch of extra ballots mailed to it, you could, if you turn those in, first, that's a crime. We refer it to DAs who prosecute when they're able. And I say that because we don't always know who returned them. But we don't count those ballots because the signatures don't match. In states that don't check signatures, there are significant issues. Under the national law, if the Democrats' HEROES Act was successful in being enacted, you would strip mail ballots of this critical protection. So you hear people talk about it in a yes or no, and the details matter. Colorado has continued to ensure that we have the processes in place to make voting safe, and Coloradans should vote and know they can do so safely.
Very good. One more question. You mentioned part of this. One of the people speaking out against mail ballots, of course, is President Trump. You're a Republican, obviously. What do you think of some of his statements about mail ballots? And do you worry about some of that misinformation he's putting out there?
I worry about the generalizing that takes place. If he's referring to the House bill, he's absolutely right. That would be ripe with fraud. If he's referring to Colorado's system, it's not. And you hear people talking about mail ballots without making that distinction on both the left and the right. And so you really have to look at the details. You have to look at the specifics of laws. For example, California doesn't allow Republicans generally to appear on the November ballot. The last two US Senate races were between two Democrats. They suppressed about 2 million votes in the US Senate race. That's the difference between the presidential race and the Senate race when the current vice presidential nominee was elected. So when you talk about voter suppression, again, you have to look at the actual effects that occur. And no one does more voter suppression than California, where they don't even let Republicans be on the November ballot.
Different system, at least on that one. That's the conversation for another day. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Amber, let's move to you next. As CEO at National Vote at Home, you monitor mail ballot voting across the country. And so you might be able to answer the question that we had from a reader earlier about what people in Colorado can do to help ensure the integrity of elections elsewhere across the nation. Also, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about how secure our mail ballots are here in Colorado.
Absolutely, and thanks, John, for inviting me to be here today. As you mentioned, I ran elections for 13 years in the city and county of Denver, and was instrumental in designing the package of reforms that we passed 7 years ago. A small group of us that were actually at the county level, the Fab Five, as I always call us, but there was a five of us women from various parts of the state, all over the state, bipartisan coalition, and I was one of the unaffiliateds in that. But we worked together with the state legislature to come up with the package that now has made Colorado one of the top states to vote in, one of the most secure, and certainly one of the highest with turnout. And now other states have adopted what we passed. Oregon and Washington both modified some of their laws based on the reforms that we made. Utah modeled their reforms after us. My organization helped pass legislation across the country last year in Hawaii, and then we've also been instrumental in helping Nevada, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., and a lot of the other expansions that have happened this year in the middle of the pandemic. So we know Colorado's model works, and it was designed really by the local experts that run elections in a bipartisan way, which I think is really the strength of it. Even though the Secretary of State at the time opposed all of it, we still, worked together to provide a voter first model. And that's really the benefit of Colorado's model, including all of the security enhancements, the registration modifications, all of that packaged together makes Colorado one of the best models in the country. In terms of how this is sort of panned out across the country, what I also like to say, and what I've been describing to folks as I speak about this almost every day, a few times a day, is that voters themselves have three different options in all states. All states offer in-person voting. There's no such thing as universal vote by mail or all vote by mail. Every state offers in-person voting in one way or another. And some states offer early voting, some have no early voting at all. And so what voters have been faced with this year is really three different options to vote. And we're seeing historical interest in vote by mail. And frankly, before 2020, vote by mail was exponentially increasing across the country. That's been the case for going back all the way to 1992 now. We've seen a steady increase in the use of vote by mail. And so it's a customer-driven model change. I mean, that's really what we're seeing, is that voters find it convenient, find it secure, enjoy the extra time at home to vote their super long ballots like what we have here in Colorado if you're in a state with a long ballot. And so there's tremendous benefits. And then the pandemic rose up. And really what happened is a lot of states that have not had a historic great number of people voting by mail had to adjust really quickly, and they weren't ready. Colorado's model, we were ready. We were ready to vote in a pandemic. We didn't have to make all of these adjustments like what other states have had to make. And so that's really what has been challenging this year, is that Congress has failed to provide the financial support to states that was needed in the middle of a pandemic. So that's kind of problem number one. Problem number two is state legislative bodies like in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin are three great examples. They've completely failed to take the suggestions of local election clerks and experts that have been saying we need more time to process ballots, and that's not a controversial or partisan thing. We just need more time, and they've all failed to meet those needs and demands of election officials. So those are like the variance by state is incredible, actually. The variance of rules, the variance of program. But where states have been successful are those that have adopted, for instance, our recommendations, have adopted some of our recommendations that we've been making to states across the country, including ballot tracking and online absentee requests and envelope and instructional design changes. All of those things have improved the process to make it more secure, make it more transparent. And one of our recent examples of this is actually Georgia. Georgia gets a terrible rap for elections, which I think is unfair, because they actually provide more options than, say, the state of New York or some of the other northeastern corridor states. But they get a bad rap. And what they recognized early on is working with an organization like us, we could help them with recommendations. So they've implemented statewide ballot tracking. They actually announced theirs before Colorado announced theirs recently. They implemented online absentee application. They expanded the number of days for election officials to process ballots. So they made they made a lot of improvements that are going to help. And, so that's one example of a good success story. But this has been a tremendous challenge. Like, I've got a team of people working in multiple states, and it's just been a challenge to get people up to speed, because there's been challenges, frankly, that lie at the hands and the feet of the policymakers that have failed in some states, and then also failed at the congressional level by not providing enough funding.
Wonderful, thank you. Nathan, let's bring you in here. You lead a new team announced just back in July to assess threats to Colorado's election. In particular, in the cybersecurity realm and misinformation. I'm wondering if you can quickly run us down those major threats you're seeing right now and what the state is doing to counter them.
Sure, John. Thank you for inviting me on today. And Amber, nice to meet you, and Secretary Williams, you as well. The threat environment is noticeable. Very quickly, the Director of National Intelligence Office has released 2 kind of public warnings since July. DHS recently put out a warning, and FBI and DHS jointly have put out about 6 warnings in the past couple months. So we're looking at about nearly 10 public warnings from our national security agencies. That should say something, and we shall be very aware. In terms of the threat of cyber attacks is always there. But based on what they're saying right now, we think the biggest threat is in the, as Secretary Griswold said, the dis and misinformation realm. And in particular, we think that foreign enemies are trying to undermine confidence in our electoral process, and very specifically the election results. And so to that end, we're doing a number of things. First, on the cyber thing, I will tell you that in the 2 months I have been here, I've been very lucky to walk in and work with some amazing colleagues in the cybersecurity side of the house. All Coloradans should be very happy and confident that their team here is working overtime for them, and led by folks such as Trevor and Craig and Rich, and public servants who you'll never meet, but work tirelessly to ensure our systems are secure. And so they are doing a number of things. They are working with federal government agencies to share information on warnings and indicators. And they are also, as Secretary Griswold mentioned, working with the National Guard. They also run a number of various cybersecurity checks on a weekly basis, and have ramped those up leading up to the election. Now, on the dis and misinformation front, there are a lot of things we're actually doing, and we're very excited about it. And just to be very clear, while the threat environment is significant, we're not powerless. Like, we, as all Coloradans, as all Americans, can fight back. And the best way to do that is to ignore information when you're not sure of the source. So, opinions are fun, but facts are better. And if you have any question about registering or voting or results, go to govote.gov. To that end, we're, as Secretary Griswold mentioned, working to ensure the public knows this message. They know to go vote and to ignore opinions. Secondly, we've been reaching out to a range of entities across Colorado, from religious organizations to business organizations to unions, to ensure that they are aware of the threat and that they can ensure their members know to go to reliable information or reliable sources for election information as well. And there are a number of things that we're doing kind of behind the scenes, and we can talk about that maybe post-election, John, but we are really working hard to ensure that all Coloradans can retain confidence in their system. If I missed anything, please let me know.
Well, maybe just add just a little bit more specifics when it comes to, in particular, the cyber attacks. I haven't seen this in the news much, except maybe that the federal government disabled a bot farm. What in particular are we seeing, and how serious is it? Is there anything specific you can share maybe on this issue?
Sure, and I think you're probably, and I'll throw out some technical jargon here, the TrickBot stuff that Microsoft probably went after, and there were reports in the news about our partners in the federal government may be working on things related to that as well. So look, I can't get into any details on any of that stuff other to say then, again, as our national security agencies have mentioned, while the threat of cyber attacks remains, the biggest threat right now is probably on the dis and misinformation angle as it relates to undermining confidence in our electoral process.
Very good. And now we'll turn to some reader questions. And if you have more, feel free to drop them in the chat. Amber, I want to start with you. There's a question in the chat about what is the state's Secretary of State's office doing to monitor ballot processing activities at the county clerk levels. And this brings up a larger question that some might not be aware of, but in Colorado, county clerks run elections and it's overseen by the Secretary of State's office. Do you feel like that makes our system more or less secure? And can you talk a little bit about how the county clerks work with the state?
Sure. Well, and actually across the country, elections are run at the local level. The secretaries of state in every state, and there's only, I think there's 33 to 35. I kind of lose that number sometimes, but there's essentially that many that are chief elections officials. Some states have state boards of elections. Some states like Illinois, the Secretary of State has nothing to do with elections. So it varies. The governance structure varies at the statewide level. Secretaries of state oversee policy and regulations, but they don't run the actual election. They're not programming ballots necessarily. They're not counting ballots. They're not doing registration. So that is a very localized phenomenon in Colorado at the county level. One thing I would differentiate Colorado, if you look at Michigan or Wisconsin, they're even more localized in that they run it at the city level. So in Wisconsin, there's almost 1,200 different election officials that run the process versus 64 counties in Colorado. So Michigan and Wisconsin are two places that are extremely localized, and it's much more difficult for them to adjust and be more agile in a pandemic and things like that because it is so localized. So our process, 64 counties run the process. They're hiring people to run the vote centers, count ballots, all that. And one thing, the beauty of our process in Colorado is that the counting process is centralized. So every ballot where it gets counted is in one of those county official headquarters instead of votes being tabulated at polling places and kind of all over. So from a risk mitigation perspective, I actually think Colorado's model is far better than some of the other more decentralized aspects. And it's got about the right balance of decentralization without introducing additional risk like city level processing of ballots. And the other thing is, and Denver just announced this the other day, and in my organization, we just drafted a white paper outlining tips for transparency of the ballot counting and processing activities. And there's some really good things that Colorado does that are standouts compared to other states and other jurisdictions around the country. And that includes, Denver and Boulder are both great examples. So is Jeffco. They have done media tours and they do public tours of the process. They've done that for a long period of time. Now in COVID and the pandemic, some of that's more difficult. So even last week, Denver announced they're live streaming all of their ballot operational areas online every day. So that can introduce transparency. It gives the public an ability to watch the process because ultimately it's the public that needs the accountability over the process more than anybody else. So those are the kinds of examples, and I think we'll probably see more examples of that in counties across Colorado. And this is another way that Colorado leads the nation in these sorts of best practices and innovations.
Wonderful. Secretary Williams, you've seen this from both ends as the county clerk and a state secretary. Talk to us a little bit about how that works, and to Amber's point, the question of transparency. Is there more we could be doing here in Colorado?
So yeah, it is an important balance, and Colorado, I think, strikes it pretty well. You've got things mostly in control of local officials, but you have both parties providing judges so that you have bipartisan judges, regardless of whether the clerk's a Democrat or a Republican. They're going to be both Democrat and Republican judges. And I responded to a chat question a little bit earlier, which is that we actually made it easier for a county that might not have enough people in one party to use judges from another county. There are times when the Secretary of State has to step in and help. We've had, particularly in smaller counties where you have the kind of turnover where you might have a completely new group of election officials, where the Secretary of State's office has stepped in, has helped has provided assistance. The large counties often help the smaller counties as well. And so we're there as that backstop. In a few occasions, Secretary of State's office has required a county to hire an additional person to help because there were issues that were taking place, or we have sent staff members to help in that process. So that balance does take place. Sometimes it occurs when we find out there was an issue. Pueblo, for example, one year did not send their cure letters in a timely manner. And so we intervened to ensure that they did that in the future and to make sure they knew what those requirements were. Secretary of State also provides training and a host of other things. So there's that close balance where the Secretary of State's office, where the large counties are all trying to help each other and make sure that elections work well.
Do you feel like there's anything more Colorado can be doing, whether it's on transparency, as Amber mentioned, or maybe when it comes to misinformation, as Secretary Griswold mentioned? What would make Colorado's elections more secure?
So I think we do an extraordinarily good job, and I think they are secure. That's not to say we can't do more. Certainly, as Nathan will attest to, adjusting to whatever the latest cyber threat is an important part that we can't rest on our protection we did a year ago. It's a constant battle. There are some things we can do. So in El Paso, when I was clerk, we built as viewing areas directly into the county areas as large as the fire marshal would allow us to build. When I was visiting a county who was building a new office, I said, hey, stick a window in there so that people can see. So there's the little things that take place on a regular basis, making sure people understand the process, putting that online is another step that we can take. We continue to work with Eric and other groups to make sure that individuals who, for example, might vote in more than one state are referred for prosecution. So that can be deterred in future actions. We've prosecute people who engage in turning in a ballot, signing it for someone else. A former chairman of one of the parties was convicted, for example. But we've also had lots of other folks. So it's that active and proactive steps that we have to continue to do, because if you stop doing it, then the deterrence goes away, then the impetus that prevents someone from trying to target the elections here goes away. And that's all part of that process. We continue to make sure that video monitoring takes place. So if you ever have a question about, well, were the ballots processed, whether they stream it like some counties with some resources are doing, or whether they don't, it's still a recording that's available. And if there's any question, a judge has the ability to review that, to make decisions. And so that's all part of the transparencies that we have here in Colorado.
Wonderful. Nathan, I want to pose a reader question to you. This comes from an election judge and who writes that they know our state has impeccable security record, but adds the president's repeated attacks on vote by mail may have caused some in our state to question the integrity. What is it that we can do to disprove these lies? And let me add another component to the question to it. Do you have a couple tips, maybe 2 to 3 tips to verify information or fight back against misinformation, as you talked about earlier?
Sure, definitely, John. So, hey, if it's okay, really quickly, to echo something that Secretary Williams said as well, and that is that this system in this state is one of the most secure in the country. And there has been amazing work done over the past decade or so here, which Secretary Griswold has continued and advanced, and all Coloradans should feel super confident in the work that's been done. John, on that note, as it relates to the president's comments, so I'm a civil servant, I'm a government employee, and I actually worked for President Trump in the federal government. I worked for President Obama and as well as for President Bush. And so I don't think that it's proper for me to get into what politicians here in the United States are saying. But what I will say is that in the warnings that I referenced earlier, it is very clear that foreign adversaries such as Iran, Russia, and China are trying to undermine confidence in our electoral process. And so people just need to be aware of that. And I would ask folks here in Colorado whether they've had any issues in previous years with the election system. And from what I understand, things have gone extremely well and it's been very reliable. And I think all Coloradans really need to remember that. As it relates to tips, again, opinions are fun, but facts are better. And so to that end, think critically about what you read, particularly online, question the source, and then go to reliable places for information. So on elections, again, you're going to get sick of me plugging this, but go to govote.colorado.gov for anything. I have a lot of family members who are awesome people and who are experts in their own area and the things that they work on. Whatever that may be. They're not experts on election related issues. And so if I see one of them post anything about how I should go register or go to this random website for election results, I'm going to think about that for a second, and I'm respectfully not going to listen to them. And I'm going to go to the Secretary of State's office and take a look at what's going on. So I hope that answers your questions, but that's kind of some thoughts there.
Sure, I appreciate it. And we have one more question from a reader. I'm not sure who's best on this, so I'll let y'all jump in. But they ask, how does each county take care of its voter rolls so that people who have moved or died are no longer getting ballots? They write that this last one is especially necessary with apartment buildings that have many transient people, as well as retirement and assisted living homes where people either move out or die. Amber or Wayne, maybe can you tell us a little bit about how this works and what Colorado does to make sure it's secure?
Sure, let me jump in there. So part of the reform 7 years ago did a few things. First and foremost, we created an automatic address update process using not only information from government databases like the Motor Vehicle Office or Colorado Department of Public Health, like we get the death records every month, and then during the election season, that's more often. But we also enacted automatic updates with national change of address data from the post office. So there's, the reason that Colorado has the highest number of eligible citizens registered to vote, the reason that we have the fewest undeliverable ballots based on other state comparisons and based on the number of mail ballots that go out. The reason that all of that is happening is because of those reforms. We adjusted our policies to better reflect what people are actually doing, because we know that in various parts of the state, especially more urban areas or where colleges and universities might be, there's more mobility. The fact is there is more mobility amongst certain demographics, especially younger voters in the state. So we adjusted our policies to enhance that. We added more enhancements on automatic registration after in subsequent years. And then, as mentioned earlier, we're also one of the founding members of ERIC, and that was way back in 2009 when that kicked off. So Colorado's done a really good job of managing all of this data. There's also real-time checks against the Department of Correction files. So if there isn't a voter that's no longer eligible, that happens. Some counties, like where I used to be the director in Denver, they would do an aggressive outreach program for group residential facilities and assisted living locations, mainly because we also cannot mail the ballots out to those locations. We have to send a bipartisan team to deliver them if it is an assisted living or nursing home type scenario, because we want to facilitate the process and offer that support. But to prepare for that, a lot of counties will send out the complete voter registration list for those complexes and ask, has anyone moved? Are there any updates to this? Do we need to make sure we bring, do you need voter registration forms? Is there anything that happened that's different than what we show on the records? So that kind of proactive outreach gets in front of those sorts of things. And those are exactly the kinds of recommendations that would certainly improve other states, especially states like Texas and other places like that haven't done a very good job in terms of their voter rolls, and they have a lot of outdated files on the list. They've been slow to go on ERIC, all of those sorts of things. And so what we've done in Colorado is really about putting the voter first, streamlining their voter registration process, making it easier to update addresses so they don't have to fill out a piece of paper every time. And all of that has increased the number of citizen registered, taken down our undeliverable and other data quality issues, and made our state one of the best in terms of list maintenance and accurate voter files, because we also, to get you a ballot, we need to know where you are. And so your information being updated and accurate is critical in that front.
John, let me add just a couple things. Amber covered a lot of it, and but just a couple other things. We also no longer just get the death records from Colorado. We now get the Social Security death index as well. So if someone dies in another state, we get that information. We also changed the law when I was secretary so that we now are able to automatically update based on driver's license changes. We also run citizenship checks to make sure that people are legally eligible to vote. We not only get it from the Department of Corrections, but we also get records from the local sheriffs if people are convicted of a felony and are incarcerated for that. So there's a lot of things that we do that other states don't. I read with dismay a few years ago, I think it was New York, that said we change our we update our voter registration list once a year. In Colorado, clerks are doing it as we speak right now. Well, not in the midst of the election, but every other time they are doing that. They continue to make some updates now, but that process is a daily basis that is so important to the accuracy of the election. There's some databases we don't interact with yet that we really should, and that includes, for example, jury questionnaires, so that if you tell the court you have moved, that we get that information. So there's always some more we could do, but Colorado does more to ensure the accuracy of its list than I think any other jurisdiction does.
That's good to know. And we're running short of time, running over on time, but I want to ask the panel each before we go here, one final question. Where if you have one tip for voters on election day, just a short, quick answer to close this out. Secretary Williams, we'll start with you.
Don't wait till election day. Turn your ballot in sooner. You can go to govotecolorado.org. You can check that your ballot has been received. You can check that the signature cleared. If there is an issue, the sooner you vote, the more time you have to correct any issue that might be there. You never know what's going to happen. We have blizzards sometimes in November, so don't wait to the last minute. And then have confidence in our system in Colorado. If anyone asks, yes, you can have confidence in that system.
Very good. Amber, a tip for voters?
Make a plan to vote, first and foremost. So pick the day you're going to do it, spend the time. Colorado is notorious for really long ballots that take a long time to fill out. So make a plan, follow the instructions. So if it says to use black or blue ink and fill in the oval, do that. Don't use pink, don't use highlighter, don't use glitter glue, anything like that. Use black or blue ink and fill in the oval. Don't circle the names, don't underline the names, and don't write in fake people. Circle the ovals that are on the ballot and follow the instructions. So, you know, if it gets within a week of the election, turn the ballot in person. Drop boxes are used by, I think, more than 70% of the voters in Colorado. We have a very secure system. For some reason, Texas does not agree and they keep banning them. But our system is awesome and you should drop off in person if you want to do that. And then finally, what I would say is share your voting experience. People are kind of constantly now with social media sharing a lot of information about what there is. And we've seen even this week in the first 2 days of early voting in Texas and Georgia, 11-hour lines in Georgia in one of the early voting locations. So share your experience, because I think the Colorado experience is so amazing, and people, we hear about it all the time about what a great experience people have here to vote. And so share that with your colleagues and with your friends and your family. And I think that kind of information is what we need to see more of, instead of the misinformation and bad information. And then finally, if anyone can take Twitter down offline for the next month, I think that would be excellent to deal with misinformation and disinformation in some way.
Not quite sure that'll happen, but Nathan, our cyber expert, let's turn to him for a final tip here.
And I'm going to skip over Amber's recommendation there, and I can't help with that. I'm sorry, Amber.
I know.
I will keep it super short. Again, opinions are fun, but facts are better. If you have any question about registering, voting, or in particular results, go to govote.gov, please.
Wonderful. And thank you, all three of you, our esteemed panel, for their time and your willingness to answer our readers' questions. If you want to learn more about how elections work or read our Q&A about voting, you can visit coloradosun.com. I guarantee you'll find facts there, as well as some opinions, which are clearly marked. And if we didn't get to your questions, submit it online through our voter guide, and we'll try to get you an answer. Also, let me mention, we have a pop-up newsletter called It's Time to Vote. We'll send you election tips in the final weeks, and you can find a sign-up link for that on our voter guide on the website. For the Colorado Sun, I'm John Frank. Thank you again to our panel. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I hope you have a great day, and go vote.